Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46, 56 degrees.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you to Beth for introducing me to Ace in the Hole, a movie I watched for the first time a few weeks ago, and to Ellen Hoffman for inviting me to do this today. What I thought I'd do is, my reaction after watching what I discovered is a classic also in the world of journalism, movies. I didn't really know that was a thing, but this is one of the movies in that genre. Is 67 years ago. This really was a story in many ways ahead of its time, and I guess I had two reactions. One is how human nature and the way we create our media environment and what leads to the news that we decide to consume, some things have really just not changed. We would want to think in 67 years we've evolved or our practices have changed, and yet how much has changed, because this thing called the internet did not exist 67 years ago, and some of my work is really focused on the effects and the impact of that shift in our environment. So what I thought I'd do tonight, and Beth asked me to keep this to 15 to 20 minutes, so if I start to violate that constraint, someone should just wave me off, because as we like to say, the danger with academics is we're like a gas, we'll fill any container you put us in. So, but 15 to 20 minutes, no problem. So I picked out 3 lines. I promise to do my best not to spoil anything about the movie itself, but what I thought were 3 key lines, and for each of them, just a quick reaction, some of it with work that I've been doing in my lab, and in some cases just observations of what's happening in our media environment. So you will soon meet Chuck Tatum, who is on the left and is the experienced journalist with a somewhat checkered past with his young apprentice. And this first line, which you'll find as you watch the movie tonight, "Bad news sells best because good news is no news," is one of these timeless observations. And this is tied to the study that Ellen had, or Beth had mentioned, that we published back in March of this year. And what we did, and the way it relates to that line, is just how is it once we can study in detail how news spreads, not just based on what is chosen by editorial, editors and journalists to publish in the news, but what do we actually decide to spread amongst ourselves? Because of Twitter, because of Facebook, it is possible now to see the spread of news at a scale that was never possible before through data. And so I just thought I'd summarize for you what we did in this study. This is just a diagram to orient you with the basic data. I took a set of fact-checking organizations that are listed in small print along the bottom, built a database of all the stories that have ever been fact-checked by these 6 organizations, and then looked throughout the history of Twitter. We had access to every tweet ever produced in the history of Twitter, because my lab has a relationship with the company. And we went back and said, let's find every tweet that refers to one of those stories that ended up being fact-checked. And that's the first circle on the left. And then over time, let's go back and look at the historic data. And every time someone retweeted, and I say someone because we did a lot of work to remove bots, which of course we all hear a lot about now, and try to identify what we think are the human beings who retweet a tweet, and then sometimes a retweet is retweeted. So these create these cascades, so these structures over time where they start with one person tweeting and saying, hey, I just read this story about, Pizzagate, or whatever it might be, before there's been any kind of confirmation of whether it's true or false. And we get these cascades, so what we did is we ended up going through several million tweets over a decade and asked a very simple question. If you take all the stories that end up being true and all the stories that end up being false and look at how each of those two sets of stories propagate through Twitter. Do they look any different? And here's an example of a pair of stories, just visualized so you can get a sense of the representative nature of what happens. In orange is a story that propagates far further, and actually if you saw how it propagated over time, each of those branches is a retweet, and when a branch branches again, it's a retweet being retweeted, so that's actually seeing a cascade. And in blue is a second story. The little burst is where the story starts spreading. And the unfortunate part of this story is that the orange is the false story and the blue is the true story. And across millions of tweets, we saw a very striking pattern. It was not even subtle, that falsity dominates truth when it's left in the hands of millions of people to decide what to share. And so I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I'll say just overall, if you go and read the paper, in green are stories that are true, in red are the stories that are false. And I'll just summarize this graph by saying they look like two different species of news. So the question is, how is it we, the people, make this decision and sort so well, and unfortunately favor the false stories over true? And in fact, it is not subtle. We're, for example, 70% more likely to retweet a story when it's false than it's true. So one of the things we looked at is, what are people actually saying? They don't just retweet. Often people comment and share their reactions to a story. When we coded those stories by emotion terms to look at roughly what's the emotion that's being provoked by stories, there were two emotions that popped out as differentiated. When you look in green for surprise, you see that true stories lead to much less surprise reactions than stories that are false. And disgust is also higher for stories that are false. So the kind of causal story is, it appears that in the moment you read a story, without really having any basis to know what's true and what's false, the emotional reactions when something is false just tend to be, it's easier to make stuff up when you don't have to conform with reality, so it's easier to surprise. And apparently add a touch of disgust and you have the recipe for a story that's more likely to go viral, more likely to be spread. So that was a study that we published in March, and just there is a coda to the story. There's been a lot of interesting conversations with leadership of the social media platforms around using this kind of data or analytics to look for signatures of information that have started to spread, where just the social signals we are giving off are an indicator there might be something, a reason to tap the brakes on the news, and so that they don't propagate as quick. So there is work happening. A second line that caught my attention, this is the context of talking about what makes a story really grab the reader, that it's better when the person in peril is one person, better than 84, better than a million when it's just one person. Floyd Collins, 1925 Kentucky, guy stuck in a cave, front page in papers for weeks, Pulitzer Prize. Who here has heard of Floyd Collins? Can I get a, that's pretty good. 4 or 5 people. I'd never heard of Floyd Collins. I Googled Floyd Collins. Turns out there was a Floyd Collins. And it turns out one person, he was a cave owner, but he merited multiple front page, top of the fold, back when there was a fold, New York Times coverage, and in fact was covered widely across all the press. So this observation is pretty simple, which is, sound familiar? So it turns out, I don't know if it's just something about people stuck in caves. It's not that people stuck in caves are not important, but when you look in terms of the relative attention we pay, given the different situations, that some things have simply not changed. No data, no science here, just a passing observation. Here's a third line. I don't make things happen. All I do is write about them. And of course, there is feedback loops between the media and what our newsrooms decide to cover and how we react, and sometimes they become part of the news cycle. So I wanted to share, first of all, a quick story around an event where I saw an example of, I guess, a contradiction to this, and then end with another piece of data analysis we did in our lab that I think relates. So I'm sure we all here remember the unrest in Ferguson. Michael Brown, unarmed black man, was shot and killed by a white police officer. And in the ensuing protests and unrest, it became a major international media event. And there was a basic narrative of the black community in Ferguson against the white police. So the story I want to share is Jack Dorsey, who is a co-founder and co-founder and CEO of Twitter, is a friend and grew up in the area. And after this unrest began, he dropped what he was doing. He's CEO of Twitter and Square, but he went to be with his parents and join in some of the protests. And he was tweeting, of course. He does, he did build Twitter. And I had dinner with him the night he came back after 10 days in Ferguson. And what he shared with me was that there was a much more complex story actually unfolding that everyone who was there in Ferguson understood, including that a lot of the faces and a lot of the people protesting were actually not from Ferguson. This had drawn attention from many other cities, and there were actually some of the most violent protests were not actually people who lived in Ferguson. There was not one police force, there were three. There was the local, there was state, and there was national. There was definitely bad behavior from some of the local police, but it was too complex to talk about three different police forces. So the narrative, at least I heard, and that Jack knew a lot of people were seeing, was that there was just one. So there's a lot of these simplifications, and the thing that stuck with me most is he told me that he went up to one of the media crews who really looked like they were settled in for the long haul. In fact, one of the major news organizations created a cage around where their team was, and they had a crane with a camera on the end of it extending out to where the expected action would be. And Jack asked, how long do you guys plan to be here? And their answer was, as long as the ratings are good. Which actually turns out to be, part of this cycle. If you think about what was happening, or one last thing that Jack pointed out is, did you notice that the marches, the protests, were happening after dinner, also known as prime time, and that there was this rhythm that started to form, and that he could see it on the ground, this obvious interaction effect, causal in two ways with the media. Where that dinner conversation took us was, this thing called confirmation bias, where you seek out stories that confirm biases you already have. There's a certain narrative of what was happening in Ferguson that many people tuned into news come to the news with. And if the story confirms that, we're more likely to consume it. And so there's also, I think, a very important element here of the schemas, or sort of the confirmation, sort of the biases we hold for what kind of story we're expecting may play out. And a more complex or a more nuanced or a contradictory story is just harder to get across. So the last study I want to show you, which I think relates to this, is underlying social networks through which we're actually deciding what news to tune into and how we share that news. So this is a visualization of about 1 million accounts on Twitter that were tweeting about the 2016 presidential election. On Twitter, you can follow an account and they don't have to follow you back. But if you follow one another, that's a much more likely indicator that you know each other. So this is a mutual follower graph where we can see there's different cliques, different socially cohesive groups. Again, we've filtered to remove bots to the best of our ability. There's no obvious strong relationship between what people are tweeting about in the context of the election. This is a snapshot from October of 2016, so after the primaries were over. But when we recode these Twitter accounts based on what we call their political tribe, and we had a very simple definition of political tribe. On Twitter, if one of these accounts the person was tweeting about the election, and so they're actively talking in public about the election, and they're only following one of the candidates at the exclusion of the others, we'd say that person exclusively follows Kasich, or Trump, or Clinton, or Sanders. They'd become part of that tribe. And when we recolor, if you watch now, keep your eyes on this graph, you suddenly see a very different structure. In red, off on the right, is the Trump tribe. In blue, very diffuse, is the Clinton tribe. In green, actually medium level of structure, and interestingly split into two components, is the Sanders tribe. There is, in purple is a group, the majority of accounts, which were following both Trump and Clinton. This is after the primaries are over. So, it's interesting, first of all, just the cohesiveness of the Trump tribe compared to the rest of the structure. And second, so striking, look at the degree of fragmentation, just separation between these two structures. Last thing, what does this have to do with news? We were also monitoring, we built machines to read the news. So we were both processing tweets at scale, but also looking at thousands of news stories, hundreds, and then by election day, thousands per day being written across the political spectrum of media and organizations. So we took a sample of journalists, 30,000 journalists who had written at least one story in 2016, and we found them on Twitter. And we asked the question, where are the journalists in this network? Because this is a network of individuals. If we light up the journalists, in blue are the verified journalists, in yellow the unverified journalists who had at least one byline in a 2016 story. And of course, the striking pattern is where they're not. And when we started thinking about what are the narratives and what is the personal knowledge that journalists have of the entire country, this picture started to become a reflection of how many of us felt after the election of no matter where you land politically, the degree of fragmentation and disconnect. What does this have to do with confirmation bias and sort of the narratives that if there are certain points of view that are just not making it across divides, the ability for our news media or journalists to be able to provide the stories that break through and give us the nuance and different points of view become limited. So I think I'm almost out of time here, or probably should stop. I'll just end by saying on a somewhat positive note, I hope, that one of the things we're working on, I'll just be real quick here, started with an experiment in a place called Mott Haven in South Bronx. We ran an ad in a newspaper. There's a little local paper there. We want to share an important story about your neighborhood that no one else has heard yet, yours. And we went to low tech. We created what we call a listening box, microphone, a display. We set a table for two. And just as an experiment to see if people could come not to express their views on Twitter or on Facebook or try to call in talk radio, what would happen? And in a week, we had over 50 people show up and have these small conversations. But while they were talking to a facilitator, we were recording and transcribing and applying a lot of the same AI and machine learning analytics that actually power social networks. And this idea of a hosted, recorded public conversation, we very quickly realized could have scale if community facilitators stepped up and were interested, not only in hosting conversations in their own communities, but we could then tap into technology to create a new kind of network. So this is an idea now that actually shaped by some of the kind of depressing things we're seeing in the fragmented networks and the nature of fast, reactive kinds of sharing, we think we're finding there's actually quite an appetite for creating new kinds of conversation networks, and a lot of interest from certain kinds of local journalists to plug into networks like this, to tune into narratives and points of view that have more nuance than we're finding in some of the networks around us. So that's some of the work we're doing, and very much triggered by some of the amazing lines that I'm sure will stay with you as well. And I will now get out of the way and let the movie run. So thank you so much.